Welcome to this Idaho Reports Web Extra. Joining us today on the Pundits panel, we have Kevin Richard of Idaho Education News, Jim Weatherby, political analyst, and Betsy Russell of the Spokesman Review. Betsy, you had a story come out recently about a judge selection process, and it was a pretty in-depth story that had a whole bunch of different layers. Can you just give us a brief rundown?
Sure, and I think one notable thing about your interview with Senator Jim Risch is that he did not mention this issue at all, and he has not been commenting on it, although our two senators, Senator Risch and Senator Crapo, are the ones who get to suggest to the president who should be nominated to be our next federal judge. And our senators have chosen to make this process entirely secret, and it has gone on for more than a year, and no nomination has yet been made. But we have learned that there is one candidate who is currently getting background checks done by the Department of Justice, and a national expert tells us that means that the Obama administration has at least tentatively agreed to the senator's recommendation. And that one candidate we have heard is Erica Malman, who applied for a state judgeship in May and did not make the short list. And so there are questions about, is this the best candidate? How do we know? And since the senators chose to follow a completely confidential process, they've never said what criteria they're looking for, they've never said who they were interviewing or how, or really anything about this process, we really don't know.
Betsy, this is quite different from the process that we used by, what was it, Senator Kempthorne and Craig, and appointing Judge Windmill. Tell us a little bit about
Absolutely. When Judge Windmill was appointed, the senators convened a bipartisan vetting committee to look at the various candidates and rate them in a very open and transparent process. And there are a number of states, almost half of states, that do that now, including the state of Washington for their federal judge picks. In this day and age, it's really kind of up to the senators. And the reason for that is that the practice in the U.S. Senate has changed to where, although the president makes the appointment, the Senate has what they call a blue slip process. If the two home state senators don't sign off on a blue slip on the president's nominee, it won't go forward. They have veto power, and that forces the administration to work with the home state senators, and there are no rules for this process. The senators just get to decide.
What's the significance of this, Jim, especially in an area where we like to see a lot of transparency with our government and kind of see how the sausage is made?
It makes a big difference. I didn't bring a cheat sheet along for this in terms of the rulings that Judge Windmill has made over the years that impacted Idaho policymaking, but it is substantial. So this appointment is certainly by no means routine. This will have a major impact on Idaho.
Absolutely, and a federal district judge is a lifetime appointee, and the Idaho district has only two, and right now one is vacant because Judge Lodge took senior status in July, as he had said last September he was going to do. We are now down to just one of them.
Now, can you talk a little bit about the judge shortage, not just on the federal court level, but on multiple levels throughout the country?
Well, there has been this back and forth between Congress and the president in terms of these appointments, and the reluctance on the part of a lot of Republican senators to forward any names to the president, waiting until after the next presidential election year and holding out with the hope that the next president will be a Republican.
And then the result of those delays is that the courts get jammed and backed up, the caseloads are growing. I mean, if you just go down to federal court and watch Judge Windmill, it's very clear that he is struggling under a gigantic caseload. He's tired, he's doing zillions of cases, and it's like that all over the country.
Now, one of the things you mentioned in your story is Erica Malman is married to Jeff Malman, who is a political operative and active with the Republican Party. And how much of that matters? Does it come down to nepotism, or does her work experience help her stand on her own merits?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I struggled with in reporting this story, because a candidate's qualifications for judge are not determined by what their spouse does, clearly. But in this case, where we have someone who is little known, but the spouse is extremely well known, and Jeff Malman is not just any GOP political operative. He's a former chief of staff to two Idaho governors. He is the current vice president of Idaho Power, the state's major utility, and Idaho Power is very, very closely tied to Senator Risch. He actually represented them in his private law practice for years, and he has received $20,000 in campaign contributions from their PAC. And Senator Crapo also has received substantial campaign contributions. So it just raises a question of whether some kind of political tie is becoming a factor in the process rather than simply the qualifications of the nominee.
And Betsy, I would imagine it loops back to what you were saying at the outset about this process, that it's been such a confidential and secretive process. We don't know what the criteria are. We don't know who's been interviewed. And what the metrics are that are being used to determine who's on a short list. It allows a lot of speculation and a lot of skepticism and cynicism.
That's true. And I should say that I have heard that a fair number, an array of prominent Idaho attorneys and sitting judges have been interviewed for this position, but have not reached the level in selection process that Erica Malman has.
So what are the minimum qualifications, and I guess in a perfect system, how would you pick the most qualified? And apparently that's not the case that we're moving down.
I was really surprised to learn that there actually are very few minimum qualifications for a lifetime appointment as a federal judge. You're not even required to be a lawyer, but they don't appoint anyone who's not a lawyer. And instead of formal rules, there are customs that have grown up over the years. So apparently it's unheard of for anyone under the age of 35 to be appointed. 2/3 of the nominees for federal judge these days are already sitting judges at some level or another. 1/3 are attorneys coming from private practice. But there is wide leeway. And apparently over the course of our nation's history, there have been people who have been appointed federal judges who people were very worried that they had no relevant experience and would they be good, and they went on to be some of our greatest judges.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.